Turbo, can you present? Thanks, you know,
My name's Turbo, I'm an alcoholic. Hey, Turbo. This is the how and why of it. First of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. Next, we decided that hereafter in this drama of life, God was going to be our director. He is the principal, and we are his agents. He is the father, and we are his children. Most good ideas are simple, and this concept was the keystone of the new and triumphant arch through which we pass to freedom. When we sincerely took such a position, all sorts of remarkable things followed. We had a new employer, being all-powerful. He provided what we needed if we kept close to him and performed his work well. Established on such a footing, we became less and less interested in ourselves, our little plans and designs, and more we became interested in seeing what we could contribute to life. As we felt a new power flow in, as we enjoyed peace of mind, we discovered we could face life successfully. As we became conscious of his presence, we began to lose our fear of today, tomorrow, or the hereafter. We were reborn.
Thanks, Turbo.
And one more quick announcement because Ron's going to kill me. Out back to the left, that door right there, please do not use a rock to hold it open. It's open, and then it'll be open until 1 o'clock, at which point Ron will then override the system so that it remains open. So we don't have to keep it open. It just needs to stay closed, but it will be open so you can enter and leave the building as you want. And then we're also going to pass a basket real quick as we invite our next speaker up. Really glad to have him come out. And on step 3, it'll be Anthony C. from Neptune, New Jersey.
Thank you, Teddy. Good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony, and I'm a very, very, very grateful member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I want to thank Teddy, of course, for the very kind invite, and also the committee of people that put this thing together. It's been fun so far. I want to thank Sarah. What a wonderful share this morning, and Caroline, whatever she's doing. It was really, really good. I'm a little nervous, to be frank. I haven't really been speaking much lately. Last year, I became very hyper aware of the ego connected with, speaking at Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and my propensity to use it as a crack pipe. You know what I mean? And I started to just kind of take a break from it. So I'm really not that polished. So when I'm thinking about this week coming down here, and I know Sarah's speaking, and Devin's speaking, and Chad's speaking, and Julie's speaking, and all these people that I know are very eloquent and probably sound a lot better than me. I'm a little nervous, but I think that's a good thing. I think that's like that God thing inside of me that's, just kind of nudging me and letting me know that I'm not the center of me. I like to think I'm the center of me. When I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was like, it was probably in the 1990s. I started going to AA meetings, and I kind of like what Sarah said about using Alcoholics Anonymous as a dating service, because that's the truth. I was showing up to AA, and I was showing up for all the wrong reasons. I never really wanted to do what you guys, we're doing, because there were people staying sober back then. Believe it or not, they were staying sober, and people were making suggestions to me, and I was just going in and out looking for the pretty girl. I was looking for the people to hang out with. I love to play misery poker with people. You guys ever do that? Dude, I go to the diner and share the war stories in a pissing contest, like who's worse, who's worse than who. And believe me, I'm the worst. So if you want to talk to me after the meeting, we'll talk. You know what I mean? But here's the thing, it's like I never really made that decision, to put recovery first. And we talked about the problem this morning. And we talked about the whole problem. Step 1 is the whole problem, And the truth is, I'm different than other people. I'm just different than other people. We had to fully concede to our innermost self, the book said. I really, 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 really got to understand that I'm always going to be different than other people. I'm never going to be like normal people when it comes to alcohol and drugs. I'm just not. And it's the truth. When I start to use it, when I start to experience that effect, I don't know, man. I just lack the ability to control it the way other people do. You know what I mean? That's simple. It's not that I can't stop. I always do stop. That's the truth, right? I always do eventually stop, just not when I want to stop. You know what I mean? And I'll tell myself all kinds of crazy things like, yeah, dude, I'll be home at 11:30. I'll be up for, work at 8:30 in the morning, and I'll go home, and she's never going to leave me again. Just never works out that way. In fact, I remember this one time where, oh my God, I was so heartbroken. I had met this girl in Alcoholics Anonymous, and look, I got to share my statistics, right? My sober date is May 1st, 2016. It's not my first sober date. I hope it's my last, I have a sponsor. His name is Harold. He's from St. Louis, Missouri. He's a great guy. I sponsor a bunch of guys, and my home group is the Design for Living group in Alcoholics Anonymous. I had come into Alcoholics Anonymous and did a few of these things, like, I went through the steps, I wrote the inventory, I shared it with another guy, I made some amends, and, as a result, I started to put a little bit of time together. And I started to collect some stuff, because what happens when we put time together is we collect some things, you know what I mean? And, the first thing I did was I collected this real pretty girl, and I met her in Alcoholics Anonymous, and she loved me, and I loved her. And I did love her, And then I collected a career. I moved out to Los Angeles, and I got myself an agent. I started doing some acting and some stunt work, and I was having some success. I was making some money. I was putting money in my pocket. And I think we talked about this morning, like when that outside stuff becomes more important than the stuff that's going on internally, And, I didn't realize it, and I don't have to go on and on about it because it was already talked about today, the fear, right? All that fear. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not good looking enough. I just never, I'm always discontented all the time. You know what I mean? It's like no matter how many women are chasing around after me, I'm not good looking enough. No matter how much weight I can lift at the gym, I'm not strong enough. No matter how much money I'm banking and putting in my pocket, I'm not successful enough. And it's like, it's just that God-sized hole that's inside me that there's only one thing that's going to fill that. And that's God. And that's love. And that's forgiveness. For myself and for us, I went through a real hard time this last year where it was like so many people that were close to me hurt me. They hurt me, man. I had someone walk out on me, wouldn't even give me a reason why. I had an employer that had employed me for 5 years that just dumped me. I have a mother who's dying of dementia. Just the other night, she was physically attacking my father, telling him he's not, he's not her husband, he's some stranger, and she's going to call the police and have him carted out of the house. And I jumped in the middle. I said, Mom, that's your husband for over 60 years. He's the owner of the house, please. And she turned around and said, no, he's not. And she came at me. She's going to call the cops on me. She physically attacked me. And then the icing on the gravy is, and this was the worst of the worst. This was the worst of the worst, because Caroline talked about losing her cat, I had this dog. I got this dog. I bought it for the girlfriend that I'm about to tell you about. We lived in this kind of nasty neighborhood in Los Angeles, and she was kind of concerned for her safety when I wasn't there. When we first got to Los Angeles, so I said, look, I'll get you a pit bull. You walk around the neighborhood with that thing, nobody's going to bother you, And, man, she loved that dog, but, she decided she was going to leave me in the middle of the night. Why? Because I stopped doing everything that was really good for me. I stopped doing everything that was really, really good for me, I stopped going to that home group. I stopped working with those sponsees. I stopped doing that evening review. Probably the last thing to fall off was my trust in God. Just stop praying, I was sitting at the table looking at my star meter on IMDb, Then the next thing that happened was I picked up. Now, it didn't happen overnight, it was a gradual effect. But I can tell you within 6 months, I was putting things right to my vein, and I was disappearing for days and days and days, and staying in extended stay hotels and doing nasty things with nasty people, and eventually she just left a note on the counter. You know what she did? She left me with that dog. She didn't take the dog. And I went through homelessness with that dog. I was living on Skid Row with that dog. I loved that dog. That dog was a part of my whole life. He was a part of my fall. He was a part of my rise. He was a part of my recovery. He slept with me in my bed every night longer than any woman ever did. And this past December, the dog got so old, he was urinating his bed. You know, I knew what I had to do. You know, and I brought him down to that veterinarian. And he was looking at me with those big brown eyes. They put it in his vein, and I helped him, and I felt his last heart rate. I heard his last breath, you know. I brought him home. I dug a hole. I put him in a hole. And I put one shovel of dirt after another shovel of dirt after another shovel of dirt with tears. It was the hardest thing I ever had to do. I never had a kid, but that was the closest thing I had. I never want to have another dog. I never want to go through that again. But I went through all that last year, you know. And I find it so difficult to forgive the people who hurt you the most. I just do. What do you guys think about that? Is that hard? You know? But that's where I find God. That's where I find God. I forgive you, and I love you anyway. You know? So, I'm coming in and out of Alcoholics Anonymous for a long time. I'm just not doing what listen, I'm just going to kind of talk about this, right? Because we're talking about the steps here. My problem is this. I put it in me. I lack the ability to control it. But my real problem is that I just can't stop picking it back up. You know, and it doesn't matter if I put 3 months between me and the last drink. It doesn't matter if I put 6 months between me and the last drink. It doesn't matter if I put 9 months or even 5.5 years. Because that happened too. I eventually pick it back up because there's something wrong with my brain. Do you know that alcoholism is a mental illness? Do you guys realize that we are mentally ill people? I'm serious. We are mentally ill, man. And it's not a mental illness like, you know what it's a mental illness like? Schizophrenia. Because it tells us all kinds of crazy things about ourselves, about the world around us. And it tells us that one lie that we're just going to believe again and again and again. This time it's going to be different. Sarah talked about it really eloquently, especially I identified with everything she said about the relationships. This time it's going to be different. She's going to treat me. She's going to love me the way I need her to love me, you know? And I end up putting myself in a position to be hurt again and again and again. It talks about that in the third step, right? We place ourselves in a position to be hurt, you know? And I can't see any of this stuff until I actually put it on paper and I write some inventory. But I'm a really sick guy. I really am. I'm healthy in a lot of ways, but when it comes to my alcoholism, you know, we all belong in a mental hospital. I'm serious. I was in and out of treatment centers for most of my 20s and 30s, and these places are mental hospitals. That's what they are, you know. And so, but we have to be pretty badly mangled before we come to that place where we make a decision. You know, so we have the problem, you know, we have the solution. Caroline talked about it. And listen, the solution is simple. You know, we have one problem in Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's alcoholism. It's not even alcohol, it's alcoholism, right? We have one solution in Alcoholics Anonymous, and if you disagree with me, please talk to your sponsor. Don't come up to me after the meeting and Please. Go to your sponsor. Anthony C. goes in the first column, and then you go 3 columns across. We have one solution, and that's a relationship with God via the vehicle of the 12-step program of recovery. Period. And now we're asked to make a decision. You know, and look, I was like this, man. In May 1st, 2016, I have that sobriety date. I was told you need a sobriety date when you got here, and I was told if you don't know when it is, pick it out. And honestly, it wasn't May 1st. It was sometime in April, to be honest with you. I was in a coma and I was like, had no idea what was going on, but I just picked that day. You know what I mean? And it made sense to me. But every time the world goes around the sun, man, and that day clicks in, it's a reminder to me that that's when something changed. Something changed in me. And I'm going to be frank with you guys. I went through the 12 steps with a sponsor, and we sat down with a big book, and blah, 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 blah. But I went through the first 3 steps before I even sat down with that sponsor. You know what I mean? I made this decision before I even sat down with that sponsor and decided to go through with this program of recovery. You know? And I knew, you know where I learned my first step truth? Out there on the street. I knew I couldn't stop. You know what the difference between me and a non-alcoholic is? I can't stop, period. You can call it what you want. I just can't stop. And I can't stop doing a lot of stuff, you know. And you know where I learned my second step truth? Also out there on the street. I'll never forget, there was this time where I really was in a bad way. Anybody ever been in those places where you're just in a bad way? I was in a bad way, man. You know, I got pulled over, I got arrested, there was a prostitute in my car, I was smoking crack, I was out of my mind. You know, lost everything, the job, everything else. And I went stumbling into this church, you know, to talk to a priest, because that's the only thing I could think of and where I could go. You know what I mean? And I sit down with this guy and I start talking to him. And I'm telling him, dude, you have no idea what my life is like. I'm talking about the alcohol, the drugs, the prostitution, all this like gnarly sex stuff I've been doing. But at some point in the conversation, I said to him, man, it feels like the devil has me, man. And he's got his claws in me, and he just won't let me go. And then I told him all this other stuff. And I got up to walk away from this guy. And you know what? Man, I said some really sick things to a priest. And I'm not even going to say the real stuff I said, because I don't want to disturb or traumatize anyone here. But he looked at me and he said, Anthony, you said one thing that I think is incorrect. And I said, what's that? He said, you said the devil has you and he has his claws in you and he won't let you go. He said, I want to assure you that God has you deep in the palm of his hand and he will never, ever let you go. Even in the hardest of times. And I want to say something, and you know, if you're going to disagree with me, fine. Again, talk to your sponsor. I think there's something that we sometimes misunderstand in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's that little paragraph on page 52, right? We call it the bedevilments. We have trouble with personal relationships. And there's a whole army of people that go around saying, this is untreated alcoholism. And I disagree. I think whether I'm connected with God or not, I'm going to experience those bedevilments in my life. You know why? Because I'm human. And that paragraph is the number one argument in this whole book for why I need God. I'm always going to be disconnected with God on this earth because I'm in this body. This is a vessel for the Spirit. This is keeping me disconnected. One day I will return to the source. But for now, I'm alone. And I need to seek him. You know, I called up a spiritual, what I think is a spiritual master, and I called this guy up, and I said, and I was kind of being a wise guy, and I said, brother, if God is so good and God is all love, then how come he makes us all so broken? And that's the truth, right? I am broken. I'm broken, man. I'm a broken top. And I can try to fix it all I want. I'm never going to fix it, you know? And he said, Anthony, I think you're missing the point. I said, what do you mean you're missing the point? He said, well, I think God makes us so broken so that you'll need God. You'll want God. You'll seek God. You'll love God. And to me that made sense. That was a pill I could swallow, you know? So, I don't know, man. Sometimes, I came out of this treatment center. It was probably, let me see what time we got. I came out of this treatment center. It was probably like, let's see. Sometime in March of 2016. And I had moved down, I told everyone at the treatment center, look, I want to go back to Charlotte, North Carolina. I want to reconnect with my sponsor, Tom Olson. And, just get me into a place down there. And they got me into this halfway house. And, dude, man, I got to this halfway house and I was just so restless, man, and irritable. And I'm like, I don't want to be living with these guys. And the first thing I did was go out and get a job. And then the next thing you know, I'm on Plenty of Fish. I'm looking for a girlfriend because that's going to fix me, right? They always do, dude. And let me tell you something, man. I could sit up here and I could tell you I'm a recovered alcoholic, and I do believe that. But I still have the propensity to believe this. If I just get the right relationship. I got out of this relationship back in October, and I was doing heartbroken. I spent time being alone. I need to spend time being alone. I need to spend time being with God. Because the truth is, and this is the truth, right? That if the vertical relationship is right, all of these horizontal relationships tend to work out. If the vertical relationship is askew, none of these relationships work. You know why? Because I'm lost in all that ego. I'm lost in all that pride. I'm envious. I'm jealous. I'm lustful. And I step all over you. And I think we as alcoholics have a responsibility to keep this right. Right? Because if I'm walking in there and I'm just creating damage, I'm just taking another hostage, man. It's not fair. I don't like when people do it to me, and I'm not going to do it to other people to the best of my ability, But I found this girl, and she was the perfect girl. Let me tell you something, man. She had borderline personality disorder, and along with an array of other stuff. And she had basically a pharmacy in her purse. And I found this little bottle that said Klonopin on it, right? Anybody know what that is? And man, did I have a party with that? But let me tell you something, man. I disappeared, man. And I was ripping and running on the streets and doing everything I love to do the best, sticking stuff in my veins and everything else. Robbing, stealing, oh my God, horrible. For weeks. And then I had been beaten and stabbed and thrown into this hospital. And most people get beaten and stabbed and left for dead and they're in a hospital. They're like, well, dude, maybe I should do something to change my life, you know what I mean? But not me, man. I was 40 years old, man, and I'm shocked, dude. I had nothing. I left that hospital. I went back to, ripping and running. And 2 weeks later, I'm back in the hospital, And this time, I'm hooked up to all kinds of stuff. I got, kidney dialysis, machines. I got a catheter stapled into my neck. They told me at the hospital I had hepatitis C. Horrible. I was in a bad place. My whole right arm was paralyzed. I couldn't feel it. It was just blown up like a Goodyear blimp. And I'm 40 years old, man. I don't have a pot to piss in. I don't have 2 pennies to rub together. Everything I owned was stuffed in a hefty, garbage bag and tied up and just, stuffed away somewhere in a 2002 Jetta that had no transmission and I had no idea where it was. None of it. I had no driver's license. I had no social security card. I had no birth certificate. I had no idea how I was going to get my life together. You know what I mean? And I was shocked. 40 years old, Oh, and by the way, I had no medical insurance either. So as soon as I was done at this hospital, and I was there for a couple of months because they had me on kidney dialysis, but, good news is if you need something like that, they're not going to throw you out. But believe me, as soon as they were able to take me off that, they dumped me in a homeless shelter, And I called this guy, Tom, who was my sponsor, or I called him my sponsor for 10 years. He wasn't really my sponsor, though, because I didn't take any of his suggestions, you know what I mean? He was just the guy that would answer my phone every single time I was in a bad way. Anybody had a guy like that? It's anytime I was at a homeless shelter or in a jail, county, whatever it was, you know what I mean? I would call him and he'd pick up. And let me tell you something, man. That dude taught me something about unconditional love. He never judged me. He never told me, hey, Anthony, take the cotton out of your ears and stick it in your mouth. Man, I hate when people say that in AA meeting. I want to choke them. Dude, who the hell are you, man? You know what I mean? Yeah, listen, man, if you ever walk into an AA meeting and you feel like someone's condescending on you, they probably are, And let me tell you something, it's not my job to condescend on anyone. Any newcomer who comes into the room, you have no idea what they're walking in for. You have no idea. They could have been gang raped behind the 7-Eleven. You know what I mean? Our job is to wrap our arms around these people and to treat them with love and tolerance and kindness. You know what I mean? And Tom always did that for me, man. But I'll never forget, man, I called him up from this homeless shelter and I'm just going on and on about my life. You know, and I'm going on and on and on about why my life sucks. And the truth is, like, I was physically and sexually molested as a child by a man, which was something that I carried around a lot of guilt and shame about. You know what I mean? I had been through one traumatic relationship after another traumatic relationship after another traumatic relationship. In fact, I'm going on and on the phone with about this one girl who I was engaged to, who, you know, I loved her more than anything in the world, and I went out and I bought her a 2-carat diamond ring, and she left me 2 months before I was supposed to marry her, and I was so angry, you know? But I'll never forget, man, I was just going on and on, my mom, my dad, my brothers, my employer, and he said something to me, man, and this does relate to this third step, you know, it really does. Because he said something to me that went from my head to my heart because it was the truth. He said, Andy, I'm not going to argue with you. Your life does suck. He said, I wouldn't want it. And in fact, he said, there's no one I know today that would want to trade their life. But you have to understand that your life is in the condition it's in. Not as a result of what all these people do to you. Your life is in the condition it's in because you make the same choices again and again and again and again and again. You're going to continue to make those same choices unless something deep down inside of you changes. You got to make a decision right here and right now. You're going to choose God and recovery and life and love. You're going to choose that. Or you're going to choose relapse and death. Because that's all that's left for you, man. And I just started bawling, man, because I knew what he was telling me was 100% correct. I took that third step right then and there. You know, listen, I know, and when we talk about this book, I know what it says. It says the first requirement, you know. And listen, I could see that my life run on my will was a disaster. It was like I came out of Baghdad, out of Iraq. That's what my life looked like. It was a horror show. It really was. You know, it's funny. I'm just going to tell a funny story because when I was out in L.A. and there is this there's this sentence and how it works. It says this, right? It says. There are those too who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders, but many of them recover if they have the capacity to be honest, right? And I'm cruising around through Los Angeles. I'm living in Los Angeles. And I'm cruising around. I had relapsed, and I'm looking for a sponsor, and I haven't really lost everything yet. And I see this one guy, man, you know. And this guy, like, honestly, man, don't get angry with me, but the guy looked like a retard. You know what I mean? He was like, dude, the guy was like a slurred, cognitive, and he was walking around with a cane. And as I heard him share, he said he was a veteran, and he had been in Iraq, and he got hit with a piece of shrapnel that took part of his brain out, you know? And I'm looking at this guy who could barely function physically and mentally, but he's freaking sober and I'm not. And I'm like, wow, man. See, that they can actually recover if they just have the capacity to be honest. It's the truth, right? I didn't have that capacity to be honest. And there's only really one thing I got to be honest about, man. And that's my alcoholism. Why is it that we just can't get honest about the one thing that's destroying our lives? I just can't say, I'm an alcoholic, I need help. You know? Man, I asked that guy to be my sponsor, and he said, yeah. And he gave me a couple of reading assignments, and he told me to meet him at a diner, and I just never did. I never saw that guy ever. But I'll never forget that to the day of that. You know? It's the truth. So, listen, man, I'm sitting in this homeless shelter, and, I could see that my life went on my way. You know? But here's the thing, right? And I'd gone through the steps with this guy, and he said, look, man, it's like, it's like this, man. How do you make a decision, right? I mean, it's like I'm going to make a decision to drop the book. I decided to drop the book. But the decision really isn't made until I actually do it. You know what I mean? Until I actually drop the book, you know? And for many, many years, I came in and out of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I just, I'd go through the first 3 steps and then stop. And maybe you guys can, relate to that. I don't know. But I just never wanted to write a 4th step. I never did. You know what I mean? And there's a number of reasons why I never wanted to write a 4th step. Number one, I don't want to share that kind of intimacy with anyone. No one is going to know my sex inventory, man. And it's funny because I could read that whole sex inventory from up here and feel no shame about it today. Yeah, dude, I did all kinds of crazy stuff. Yeah, I sold my body, all that stuff. Yeah, I did all those things. But I was so afraid to share that with people. And here's the thing, it's like, if you're new here, it's like, you just got to make a decision to put yourself in the middle of this thing, I don't know, I was cruising around Alcoholics Anonymous for a lot of years, and I'm pretty good at the gab stuff, so I'd hear Devin say something, I'd hear Sarah say something, I'd hear Chad say something, and then all of a sudden I combine what they'd say, and I'd walk into a meeting, and boom, I'm sounding like a, guru, you know what I mean? But I can't stay sober, man, and I'm cruising around Alcoholics Anonymous, walking in and impressing all these newcomers, and then one day this guy corners off with me at the end of the meeting, and he walks up to me, and he goes, "You know something, guy, you're full of shit," he says to me. And I said, "Come again?" He said, "Yeah, you heard me, you're full of shit." And then he asked me a question, and listen, for all you new people here, or even for some of you old-timers that have been around and maybe haven't been through this work or haven't done it in a while, really consider this question. Because he said, "I want you to consider this." And you know what a consideration is? It's not something you just bark and answer at. It's something you think about. It's something you take in prayer and meditation, right? He said, have you ever really done the 12 steps? And really, really, really taken a full measure, not half measure stuff. And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" He said, "Have you ever written the inventory, shared the inventory, gone to God with your character defects, asked for the transformation, made the amends, and carried the message to another alcohol?" And I looked at him, and I'm Mr. Bullshit, but probably the first honest thing came out of my mouth, and I just said, "No." And then never done it. And he said, "Look, why don't you just take a few months, man? Go through this process, and if on the other side of this thing, if it doesn't work and God doesn't remove the obsession to drink alcohol and your life doesn't get any better, you can come back here and tell me, Tom, you're full of shit, and we will refund all your misery on the spot." Boom, there it is. He said, "But, what happens if you go through this work, God removes that obsession to drink alcohol, and your life gets astronomically better? Isn't that a miracle?" And listen, man, in Alcoholics Anonymous, we talk about the wholesale miracle. And fortunately, it's not for people who want it. It's not for people who need it. It's really only for the people who are willing to do it. And if you do these things, the miracle we talk about is transformation. It's the power of resurrection in our lives. I was a man who was a dead man walking. And I'm living and breathing today. I'm sharing the best news ever. And I'm telling everyone in this room that God is love. That God is unforgivable love, unabashed forgiveness, redemption, resurrection, and transformation. And so I'm going to tell another story because I was cruising around AA and I was probably like 4 or 5 years sober this time around. And I had a lot of the feelings that I heard other people discuss today, and I felt like less than. Now I could go down the checklist and I could say, check, I wrote the inventory, check, I've shared the inventory, check. I'm hyper aware of my defects of character, and I go to God on a regular basis and check. I pray, meditate, review, sponsoring others. But there was just, I don't know, I felt like a fraud, There was just this voice deep down inside of me that was just telling me, "You're a fraud," you know what I mean? And I'm crying myself to sleep at night because there's something tugging at my heart, And have you guys ever been in that place where you're in Alcoholics Anonymous, but you feel so lonely and so unloved? And you just feel like you desperately want other people to love you just to make yourself feel okay, you know? And you're crying yourself to sleep every night. You're like, dude, if people knew this about me, no one would want me to be the sponsor. Nobody would want me to be the friend, nothing, you know what I mean? But here's the thing, man, and I want to thank Devin for this, because I had been talking to him, like, this was during, like, COVID, right? And he said, why don't you talk to this guy out in Colorado? You know what I mean? And he gives me this old guy's number, and I call this guy up, man, and I'm like, brother, I just start giving him all the nonsense. I'm just throwing him all the nonsense, you know, he's just letting me talk. And at one point, he stops me, and he cuts me off, and he goes, listen, man, I'm assuming you're calling me to be your sponsor, right? Is that what's going on here? And I said, yeah. And he goes, I'm going to ask you one question alone, and I want you to be honest with me. I don't want you to bullshit me. I want you to tell me the truth. And I said, well, what is that? He said, tell me where it hurts. I didn't even know how to answer that, man. I took a minute there, and I started to, like, tear up, you know? Because there was a hurt deep down inside of me that I just wasn't getting at it, man. I just hadn't gotten at any of this stuff, man. And this is part of making a decision to put ourselves in the middle of this thing, man. We got to make a decision to change. We got to make a decision to give everything. You know what Bill Wilson says in his story? He says, we must turn in all things to the Father of light that presides over us all. That is the third step, right? That's the third step of recovery, right? What do we, you know, it's like this. What do they promise us? Freedom from alcohol. Freedom from alcohol. And what do we give in return? Well, it's a small price, but we give everything. We give it all. Everything we want, everything we desire. You know, everything that disappoints us. Man, I can't tell you how many people in Alcoholics Anonymous have disappointed me over the years. Man, it's so hard. How many women in relationships have disappointed me and broken my heart? It's so hard, man. But I've got to get in all things to God. All of them. So this old man asked me to write an inventory. You know, and listen, man, I wrote it. It was a simple inventory. Probably only about 15 pages. But it was deeper than any one that I've ever written in my life. And the one thing I wrote about, I had never shared with a sponsor before, about being sexually molested as a child. And I shared it with this guy. And I figured he lived, 15 states away, and he's, 80 years old, and he doesn't know anyone, so he's not going to say anything. Like, I needed those kind of barriers. Today, I'm standing at a podium, and I'm telling you these things. You know what I mean? But he heard it, He heard it. And he told me, man, the world and its people more often than not, but they are often quite wrong. Listen, I would never sit across from someone at a table or in an AA meeting and tell them, well, you've got to see your part in these things. Even though I did have a part in that kind of stuff. I did. I didn't tell anyone about it, did I? Not until I'm 44 years old. Yeah, and I dragged everyone in my life through all kinds of pain. Especially women I was in relationships with, pain, suffering. And you know something, man? I want to just tell you guys something, and this is the truth. Hurt people always hurt people. They always do. And when people hurt me today, I try to see where they were hurt, I try to see where they were hurt so I can forgive them. But there's another thing that we don't say a lot. I know people say it a lot, but healed people also heal, And I want to just let you guys know that while our injuries and our disease, and we call this thing a family disease. You guys ever hear that? All right? It's a family disease. And I used to think they would call it that because it's genetic and this and that. But no, I mean, we say that because of the way it spreads, and it spreads to all the people who love us and who touch us. And it does. If we're walking around Alcoholics Anonymous and we're still sick, we're still infected. You know what I mean? And we're walking around Alcoholics Anonymous and we're spreading the Spirit of God, you know what I mean? And we're spreading the Spirit of healing, you know? And so, but he said to me, he goes, listen, man, I get it, man, and, he said, I'm just an AA guy, I can't deal with that kind of confession. He told me that straight up. He goes, what do I know? I'm just a drummer. He goes, I think you should take that to a professional, you know, like a therapist or a priest, you know? And I said, I will do that. I absolutely do that. So I found this priest. I found this guy, man, and it was funny. He was like in the program, and he did what we do. And I had actually been a part of his early recovery, and so I called him up and I said, man, I've got this fifth step, and my sponsor, you know, he suggested that I read it to someone, you know, who's got, you know, a collar on, and, you know, you're the only guy I could think of. And you know who I'm talking about, right? And he said, I'd love to, man, I'd be honored, you know. And I went and I sat down with this guy and I read it to him. And, you know, it was really interesting, because the guy who had done this stuff to me was also a man of the collar, you know. And, but he said to me, man, he said, listen, he goes, this is the way I see it, man. He's like, you were 8 years old and you're kind of walking around, and all of a sudden, man, out of nowhere, this big Mack truck just comes along and bam, just smacks you, and your intestines are just knocked all over the street. You know what I mean? And the problem is, man, you're 46 years old and your intestines are still all over the street. That's the problem. And what you got to do is pick up those intestines and put them back inside you, get stitched up and heal, man. You got to start healing from this stuff. And he said, you know, my suggestion to you is to start to talk to a therapist and start to heal from this stuff. Because the way I see it is you're dragging every single person you're in a relationship with through this traumatic shit that you went through at 8 years old. And that's not fair. And that's not right. You know, and listen, man, if I didn't make a decision to put everything in God's hands and really trust this guy that Devin had given me from the other side of the country, right, that had 50 years of sobriety, I'd have never had any kind of healing with this stuff. I'd have continued to wreck everything in my path. You know what I mean? God is good. We got 15 minutes here. I want to say this, and I'm just going to tell a story because I want to talk about collateral healing. You know, and I had this uncle, and so my father's side of the family was from Little Italy in Manhattan, and very masculine Italian, you know, people. And, you know, my Uncle Carlo was like, he owned a bunch of restaurants, man. He was like the man. You know, I lionized him as a kid because he was like, he knew all these guys, and you know what I'm saying? And my father was like one of these guys that like had gone and got a master's degree and was a social worker and worked for, you know, the Department of Welfare in New York. And I just kind of like, as a kid, I like lionized my uncle. And I didn't really respect my father, but that's changed over the years. You know, it's funny, I was talking to someone the other day, and honestly, this is the truth. I don't really take relationship advice from anyone in Alcoholics Anonymous, because I look around, and none of you guys, like, well, there are certain exceptions, right? None of you guys have successful relationships, right? With the exception of a small few. It's just the truth. And I look at my father, and I look at a guy who's taking care of a woman who's attacking him on a regular basis, who's dying of dementia, who doesn't even remember who he is. He's been married for 62 years. I take relationship advice from that man. And I love him above all things, you know. But as a kid, I was ashamed of it, you know. And I wanted to be like my uncle, the gangster, who had Rolex watches and leather jackets, you know. And I had gone to NYU, and I had been there for, lived in the city. And I had finished at NYU. I went over to one of my uncle's restaurants, and I said, hey, can I have a job as a waiter? And there was this place right on Mulberry Street. He said, sure. And he got me a job. And, you know, back then I was making $1,500, $2,000 a week. It was a lot of money. This is like the late 90s. And, but, you know, the problem was I was alcoholic, even back then, you know what I mean, and drinking and doing cocaine around the clock and just not being able to show up for work on a regular basis. And when I did show up, I was in, just not in good shape. And, it got to the point where it was like, the manager pulled me aside one day and, You know, it was like, we got into this argument, and it was like, I quit, you're fired! You know what I mean, kind of thing. And I went down the street, and I got a job as a restaurant manager in this place on Spring Street. And, my father had called me up a couple months later, and he said, your uncle's sick, he's in the hospital, and he wants to talk to you. He wants to talk to all the boys, so why don't you give him a call? And I said, I started thinking in my head, like, dude, me give him a call? He fired me. He let his people abuse me. Screw him, man, He should be calling me, I'm thinking in my head, See, the problem was, like, 6 days later, my father called me and told me about it. I didn't know he had liver cancer, And he said, he was with his wife, and he took a shot of Narcan and an artichoke heart, and he went to bed and he never woke up. And you know something? I didn't even go to the funeral. So ashamed. And I walked around for years with that stuff in my heart, man. I walked around for years, man, feeling so much guilt, so much shame, how could you, and honestly, man, I'll never forget, I had this dog growing up, and I loved him, not like Rocco, but I loved him, I was like 19 years old, and my father came in and said, well, we're going to have the dog put down, and do you want to come and see him out of the world? And I was playing video games at the time, and I said, no, I'm just going to play video games, and I felt guilty about that over the years, but nothing like what I felt with my uncle. Nothing, man. And I had gone through, steps with sponsors and told them this stuff, and they said, well, write him a letter. That's what my first sponsor said. I said, all right, I'll write him a letter. He said, all right, bring it to me, read it to me. I read it to him. He goes, all right, you're done. Yeah, but here's the thing, man. It didn't remove anything. You know what I mean? I still walked around feeling horrible about this. Anytime anything about my cousins, my uncle, my aunt, anything would come to mind, I would be like, just feeling like horrible. So I went through the steps with the same guy a few years later, and he said, write him a letter. And I said, dude, you asked me to write him a letter, man. He goes, write another letter. I said, okay. You know where he's buried? Yeah, okay. Go to his gravesite, read it there, and burn it. I guess so, man. I guess I'm going to go and read the letter and burn it, man. You know what I mean? So I went and read the letter, and I burnt it, And guess what happened? Nothing. So I relapse, I get sober again, and I go back through the steps, and this guy Richie was sponsoring me at the time. He says, write him a letter. I said, bro, I've written the letter twice, man. I'm not going to write the letter. He said, just write the letter. And I said, okay, I wrote the letter. You know what I mean? And I come back with the letter. He said, who did this guy leave behind? And I said, what do you mean who did he leave behind? He said, I guess his second wife, but dude, I don't talk to her. You know what I mean? Like, I don't talk to her at all, man. She's like, dude, I haven't talked to her in 30 years. She's like, her and my parents hate each other. She's like this, really progressive Democrat, and my parents are these really conservative Republicans, and they haven't talked for years and years and years. Like, there's no contact there. And he looks at me and he goes, you don't care about that stuff, do you? And I'm like, not really. He goes, well then, dude, go and read her the letter, man. Go read it to her, man, And, dude, I want to let you know something, man. It's like, and this is where, like, I don't know, man. And he goes, by the way, it's funny I never, there was nothing in your inventory about her, You haven't talked to her in 30 years. You know what I mean? Don't you think that's a problem? You know what I mean? She's your aunt. you know what I'm saying? And so he goes, not only should you read her the letter, you should probably have a conversation with her and, clear the air because, like, it's horrible, man. Like, you haven't been part of your cousin's lives and, this is what we do in Alcoholics Anonymous, right? We repair the wreckage of the past, And I went down there and, I knocked on the door and, she lived on Prince Street and I sat down with her and I had this, like, great conversation with her and I read her the letter and I walked out of the apartment and I remember it was Manhattan and the sun was setting and there was this big orange sky and I'm thinking, like, I don't feel any different. Man, Alcoholics Anonymous is all bullshit. Yeah, anybody ever have that, like, those moments? It's like, this stuff doesn't work, And I left there, and I was really resentful. a few weeks later, I don't know, I got asked to speak at this big event. And Sarah, you were there, I think. It was a New Year's event at that old home group. And, I just, I don't know, man. I was putting on my suit. I was at my parents' house. And, because a couple of weeks before that, my father called me and he said, Anthony, have you been talking to your aunt? And I said, well, I had a conversation with her. You know what I mean? He said, okay. So I'm over the house, and I'm getting suited up, and I'm putting my tie on. And I go upstairs, and there they are. My mom, my dad, my Aunt Louise. And they're hugging on one another. And they're talking about the old neighborhood. And I'm sitting there, I just started crying my eyes out, man, because it's like, we don't talk about this stuff in Alcoholics Anonymous. When we put everything in God's hands, God, He just restores. He restores hearts. He heals broken hearts. He restores hearts. He restores lives. He restores relationships. God is so good, And I'm going to end my talk with this because there's a line in the big book that bothers me.
Just one?
It's the one that says we are not saints. And I get what they mean. We're not perfect, right? But I know a couple of things about saints. I actually, there's one saint that I read on a regular basis. His name's St. Augustine. And St. Augustine, if you guys don't know anything about him, he had really bad issues with sex. He would be considered a sex addict in today's day and age. And what happened was he had this spiritual experience and this come to God moment, where he became changed. He became transformed. And he spent the rest of his life carrying the good news of God to others. That sounds an awful lot like what we do here, doesn't it? We're these broken people. We have these come to God moments. We have these spiritual experiences that change us. And we spend the rest of our lives carrying these things to others. But he very famously said this. I read St. Augustine. I read a book called Confessions almost every day, and I read it over and over and over. And if you guys ever have a chance to take a look at that, it's a really, really interesting look at his journey to God. But he very famously said this. He said, to fall in love with God is the greatest romance, to seek Him, the greatest adventure, and to find Him, the greatest human achievement. And I wish you guys all the greatest human achievement, and I want to thank you guys for having me on. Thank you, Ted.